New York is synonymous with the skyscraper. From the Chrysler Building to the Supertalls of Billionaires Row, this city never stops reinventing itself through its buildings. These are some of our favourite skyscraper stories from the last few years. It's said that you can tell a lot about a city by its tallest structure. In New York, that was once the Chrysler Building, capitalism colliding with art and hubris to reign supreme over the skyline. The city's tallest building has of course changed hands many times since, but the Chrysler's become a landmark in the one place above all others that's now synonymous with the skyscraper. Now, it's set to be covered up by a new generation of glass-covered office towers. Manhattan simply wouldn't be the place it is today without the skyscraper. When it was first formed millions of years ago, its geographic size wasn't that notable, and if it had stayed a small low-rise island, it probably wouldn't have amounted to much. But these remarkable structures, rising from the island's solid bedrock, have let it continuously increase its area to welcome the millions of people and businesses who all want a slice of the action. It's skyscrapers that made New York. These awe-inspiring buildings have risen through every chapter of this city's story, each a product of the context and forces at play at the time, and each going on to shape the era that followed. We saw it in the extravagance of the 1920s, and then the slicked-back modernism of the 60s. Skyscrapers personified the excess of the 80s, and then found themselves with an existential crisis in the wake of 9/11 as everyone tried to work out what the future of the skyscraper would be. And now we're seeing it again in the 2020s as they come to reflect some of this city's biggest challenges. What happens in New York is reflected in its skyscrapers. They stand both as monuments to its past and silent influences of its future. This city is so much more than just the home of the skyscraper. It was made by them.
Greatness of New York is perhaps most spectacularly seen in its buildings. For here on the island of Manhattan is the most impressive concentration of stone and steel masonry the world has ever known.
New York is synonymous with skyscrapers. That's what everybody around the world thinks of first when you say the word New York.
The Chrysler Building is just the grandest of them all. One of those buildings that you can't imagine New York City without.
It was Joseph Campbell who famously said that you can tell a lot about a city and what drives it by its tallest buildings. In medieval times, it was often the spire of a cathedral. In 18th century towns, it was the political palace. And in 1920s New York, it was the office building. The American dream embodied by steel and sheer grit, the skyscraper was capitalism incarnate. The Roaring Twenties was a decade defined by excess and wealth, one which marked the transition of power from London to New York as the world's metropolis. It all gave rise to the Chrysler Building, a shining beacon that announced the city's arrival and America's wild success. What's more characteristic of the American dream than unabated competition?
I am Midwestern by birth, but I always knew I was really from New York.
Carol Willis is an architectural historian and the founder of New York's Skyscraper Museum.
Well, skyscrapers in New York and everywhere are really commercial architecture. They are buildings which are constructed to make money.
The Chrysler Building's existence was fueled by the fierce rivalry of two former business partners, architects Craig Severance and William Van Allen. Severance was hired to design the Manhattan Co. building, now known as 40 Wall Street, while Van Allen was asked to design the Chrysler Building. Both were vying to construct the world's tallest skyscraper, and both would do pretty much anything to make that happen. As the planning and construction of each skyscraper took place, the designers from either side would steal or leak plans of the buildings. The Manhattan Co. building began adding more and more floors, pushing the limits of what its foundations could handle in a desperate attempt to best Chrysler. And it seemed to work. The building completed in 1930 and was the tallest in the world for about a month. Van Allen had ingeniously constructed a secret spire inside the crown of the Chrysler building. Once the Manhattan Co. building was finished, the spire was pushed up through the roof into place, dramatically beating the other tower by 36 metres. But when the Chrysler building first appeared on the skyline, many thought it was an eyesore, and yet today it's held up as one of the world's greatest examples of Art Deco architecture. It's an undeniably iconic landmark, one of the emblems of New York.
Well, the Chrysler building, everybody loves the Chrysler building. It's such a wacky skyscraper. Everything about it is an expression of the moment in the 1920s. Recognizability, iconicity is something that has value in and of itself. When you say, I work in the Chrysler building, people know where you work.
Walter Chrysler had wanted his skyscraper to represent opulence and luxury, but that didn't go over well as the Roaring Twenties came to a screeching halt with the crash of the New York Stock Exchange and the onset of the Great Depression. The city where this worldwide economic crisis began had at the same time built a 319-metre monument to capitalism. Unemployment rates were at their peak. Nearly a third of New York City's population was out of work. The extravagance of the 20s was over. Despite all the effort that had gone into making the Chrysler building the world's tallest skyscraper, it only held the title for 11 months until the Empire State Building completed astonishingly quickly in 1930. Then, the Great Depression and the Second World War conspired to create a 40-year period without any record-breaking skyscrapers in New York. The city's focus was elsewhere, and that chapter of its history is recorded in a period of absent high-rises. When the skyscraper did finally make a comeback, it had to be seriously rethought.
I never could do that.
By the 1960s, New York was a different city. There were protests, strikes and violence. It was a time of radical change and unrest. It was a time for something new. Ornamentalism and detail weren't right for buildings. It became all about simplicity and function. In an attempt to revitalise the then struggling Lower Manhattan, Japanese-American architect Minoru Yamasaki was selected to design the World Trade Center in 1962. He put forward an idea for two enormous twin towers, a pair of grey monoliths that were almost an extreme iteration of modernism. They had sleek straight lines, were aggressively vertical, and had none of the stepbacks or details of New York City's Art Deco skyscrapers. These were buildings born out of a very different New York.
110 stories times two buildings, 220 acres of office space. That's as many square feet as exist in many downtowns of second-tier cities.
Yamasaki's fear of heights meant the towers had relatively narrow windows, just 45 centimetres wide. They only covered 30% of each building, making them look like solid metal slabs from a distance. Now, at the time, it wasn't economically feasible to build a skyscraper more than 80 stories tall because of the space that its elevator shafts would take up on the floor plate. The higher you build, the more people you have living or working up the building, and the more elevators you need, particularly in structures like this that don't taper and have a huge floor plates, even at their summits. That all means more elevator banks eating up lettable floor space. Elevators don't pay rent. To get around this, Yamasaki and his team designed sky lobbies on the 44th and 78th floors of each tower that would break up the elevator journey. Crucially, that meant that different elevators could use the same shaft and reduced the overall number of shafts needed on the floor plate. It enabled the buildings to rise 110 stories above the city, but also created a mini commute for anyone with an office above a sky lobby floor. That wasn't all. Structural engineering also had to advance to make these towers possible. The support columns for the towers were both at the central core, like a traditional skyscraper, and around the outside of the buildings. This essentially made each tower a sort of box within a box, joined by horizontal trusses at each level. This meant there were no support columns within the actual floor plates, allowing for vast open office space.
The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center is a real anomaly in the history of the skyscraper in New York, not just because they were the tallest buildings in the world, they were also exceptional because they were built by government.
The towers finally opened their doors in 1973 to a public who'd grown weary of them. The project cost the equivalent of $4.5 billion in today's money and had reportedly come at the expense of some public transportation facilities. Some residents of Lower Manhattan were still angry at having to be relocated, and critics said the towers looked like filing cabinets, or the boxes that the Empire State and Chrysler Building were delivered in. But over the next decade, they steadily became embraced as American icons, helped by films like King Kong, Superman and Manhattan, as well as Philippe Petit's heart-stopping tightrope walk between them in 1974. The Twin Towers became synonymous with the city itself.
The Micro Machine Man here, presenting the genuine original, colossally flexible, most miniature replicas of the real thing, Micro Machine.
Big hair, big ideas, big buildings. The 80s were about risk, excess and glitz. It was a time when subtlety was thrown out the window. If you were going to do something, you had to be bold. Architecture was swinging away from the restrained, clean lines of the 60s to something more extravagant. This was an era of experimentation, of clashing styles and ideas that wouldn't ordinarily work together. New York was an altogether different beast in the 1980s too. The Wall Street boom and falling unemployment spurred on the real estate market, though at the same time, the city was experiencing record crime and soaring murder rates. This was a place of contradictions, of division, of glamour alongside poverty and violence, but of extreme wealth and opportunity too. Rising from all of it was a new skyscraper on Fifth Avenue that would kind of come to embody the ethos of the era. Enter Trump Tower. At 202 metres, it was the tallest all-glass structure in the city. Wrapped in bronze with interiors made of pink, white-veined marble, mirrors and brass, the building is unmistakably 80s. It contains some of New York's most prestigious residential, commercial and retail spaces, as well as an 18-metre high waterfall and a rumoured gold toilet. Some may call it gaudy, others may call it pure luxury, and that may be precisely the point. To make way for Trump Tower, something of the old had to be sacrificed, and the Bonwit Telestore took the hit. Opened in 1929, the iconic 12-storey limestone granite emporium was designed by Warren and Wetmore, the same architects as Grand Central. Donald Trump had his eyes on the site for years, and when he acquired it in 1979, planned to demolish the building to make way for his own skyscraper. He hired architect Der Skutz, who later told New York Magazine of Trump's vision for the site. It has to flash to be good. Preservationists wanted to save a pair of 4-metre Art Deco sculptures and a large nickel-plated grille over the store's entrance. Both were promised to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but were ultimately destroyed when the effort to preserve them was found to be causing construction delays. And it wasn't the only controversy surrounding the building of this particular skyscraper. In many ways, Trump Tower embodies the runaway ambitions of this time. The 1980s were the era of Reaganomics, real estate booms, and stock market highs and lows. Capitalism, growth and success, no matter the cost. In later years, the tower's taken on new meaning, both as a place for supporters of and protesters against the former president. It's perhaps more divisive now than it was when it was first constructed, and what was a landmark of decadence is now a symbol of division. What a building represents, what it means as a symbol, can change over the years, or even in a single day. The world changed on 9/11. New York and its tall buildings were thrown into an identity crisis. How do you build a skyscraper after 9/11? Does the world even want skyscrapers anymore? For a time at the start of the 2000s, no one really knew the answer to those questions. Some said American cities should stop building skyscrapers altogether, fearing they'd create a magnet for future terrorism. Architect David Childs even said that many of his clients would not want to build such visible symbols, such iconic and tall buildings, ever again.
9/11 was a gigantic trauma for New York City and, a setback in every way, not the least widespread emotionally across the New York region. So much of the reaction was, death of the skyscraper, will there ever be another skyscraper?
One of the very few prominent skyscrapers to actually be built during this era was the Hearst Tower, rising a relatively modest 182 metres above the city. While the rest of the world was trying to figure out the future of high-rises, Foster & Partners set about completing one from the past. The firm made a conscious and active choice to push forward with construction despite the post-9/11 climate. They successfully combined modern architecture with the past before, both at the British Museum and the Reichstag. Now they were taking that technique to new heights. Constructing a vertical extension on top of the existing Hearst Tower was moderately easier than it would have been with most other buildings. The historic structure was intended to support at least 7 additional stories, with some accounts putting that as high as 20. It also had 6 elevator shafts, double or triple the normal number for a place that size. The facade of this building is more than just an eye-catching design. Its diagonal grid pattern in fact comes from its supporting trusses. But despite that striking effect, the Hearst Tower is something of a forgotten skyscraper in this city, probably most well known for being the first to emerge here after 9/11. In time, the city's high-rise hiatus began to fade, and engineers and developers started to find themselves in a race for space.
What happened after 9/11? Yes, the predictions of New York's demise and the demise of the skyscraper were far exaggerated.
As the 2000s wore on and rolled into the early 2010s, the reimagined World Trade Center began to emerge in Lower Manhattan, filling the painful void that had been left in the skyline. Formed by a potent mix of emotion, politics and compromise, the tallest new skyscraper to rise from the site sought to evoke the silhouette of the former Twin Towers as if they had merged together. It reached a symbolic height of 1,776 feet, nodding to the year of American independence, and looked down to a pair of sunken waterfalls on the footprints of the buildings that had once stood there, the sound of crashing water drowning out the city and creating a space for reflection. New York was beginning to move on, but it would never forget. In a way, the rebuilding of Ground Zero started the turning of a page and gave a kind of gentle permission to the city to start building tall again. As it turned out, the skyscraper wasn't over. It had just been reinvented. Gone are the domineering office towers, architecture is now an asset. There's not much space left to build on in Manhattan, so as the 2010s progressed, developers started getting even more inventive, constructing skyscrapers over live rail yards and pushing the limits of engineering. The 1920s may have had Jazz and Gatsby, but the 2020s has a new billionaire class. The 1% of the 1%. Never before has there been so much wealth for so few, and those people need somewhere to put all that money. Welcome to Billionaires Row. To develop the small sites remaining on 57th Street with buildings tall enough to offer Central Park views and enough floor space to make a return, developers here spent years acquiring the air rights for properties around their lots. That enabled them to combine those rights onto their sites and build their towers taller, helpfully preventing some nearby buildings blocking their views. And it's all given rise to this, 111 West 57th Street, the world's thinnest skyscraper. Rising 435 metres above the city, but with a width of just 18 metres, the structure offers ultra-luxury apartments and tries to hark back to the past. The classic stepped form has returned, as well as terracotta, a material not really seen on towers since the days of Art Deco. This remarkable pencil-thin structure and its neighbours were all born out of the latest force shaping New York: extreme wealth. These buildings are no longer simply property, they're assets. The luxury apartments they offer are less home, more safety deposit box in the sky. Many are bought and left empty, sometimes deliberately to retain their value. In mid-2021, properties in the area were half empty. Love them or hate them, these super slender towers now stand as immovable markers of this latest chapter in New York's history. They rise in a time of growing billionaire backlash, and in a world that feels like it's changing faster and more unpredictably than ever before. So what does the future hold for New York? Well, that's something that's always captured our imaginations. The far future, as unknowable as it is, may still contain flying cars and impossible superscrapers. But the immediate future is a little easier to predict. The skyscrapers of the 2030s are actually being planned today, and we've got a preview. Remarkably, we're about to see the return of the mega office building, much like the Chrysler and Empire State. New York's about to witness its next skyscraper boom. There are at least 4 new Supertalls being constructed, collectively adding some 11 million square feet of new real estate to this island. And it's all because of one little decision made in 2017, the rezoning of Midtown East. Now, please don't tune out just because we said rezoning. This is actually very interesting stuff, we promise. You see, Midtown East has a problem. It's one of the highest profile business addresses in the world. There's over 60 million square feet of office space, 250,000 jobs, and numerous Fortune 500 companies. But it's also extremely old. The average age of its buildings goes back more than 70 years.
So Midtown, and especially the zone around Grand Central, the glorious Chrysler building, had fallen on harder times in the 21st century. It was not completely wired for all of the necessity of larger digital businesses. And the spaces of the floor plates were smaller, so the historical fabric that already existed in Midtown was beginning to need to be refreshed.
In response, a dramatic rezoning or rewriting of the rules was approved by the City Council, enabling far greater and denser office buildings. In exchange for that greater density, developers would have to contribute to a new district improvement fund to create a transit and pedestrian network. Part of that is due to improve the subway in and around Grand Central. Now, we know what you're thinking, and many of the skyscrapers coming up out of this rezoning were in fact designed before 2020, and therefore meant for a very different world.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
The office as we know it is over.
The possibility of a recession is looming large as the Federal Reserve raises interest rates in the hopes of driving down inflation.
The last couple of years haven't exactly paved the way for a great office tower comeback. But that's kind of reminiscent of the birth of the Empire State Building, which found itself adding hundreds of thousands of square feet of commercial real estate into Manhattan during the Great Depression.
We may be at a time where there is a dramatic shift in the work patterns and perhaps even the occupancy of buildings, but I don't think we're at the end of cities. I think cities are our future, and they must be our future.
270 Park Avenue is one of the first new skyscrapers to enjoy the benefits of greater density. The 423-metre Supertall is designed like a series of dominoes. Just a bit taller than the Twin Towers were in 1973, the building returns to the iconic stepped form of classic New York skyscrapers, a move that makes its dominating presence a little easier to take. But 175 Park Avenue, or Project Commodore as it's also known, doesn't pull back from making an impact. This immense skyscraper is rising just across the road from the Chrysler Building, and at 480 metres will completely block out the New York icon. The famous structure from the start of our story, now superseded, consumed by that relentless race for the skies that it helped start almost a century ago. The Chrysler Building may only have been the world's tallest for less than a year. It may have been disliked when it was first constructed, but the Chrysler Building is New York. It's bold and it's brash. It's a product of fierce competition. It's an advertisement, a capitalist monument, and a spectacular piece of art. It's an eyesore and one of the most beautiful structures ever constructed. What happens if you cover it up?
New York is like all cities. It's resilient because cities are important to civilization and to economies. But you know, that value of a kind of embodied energy and investment in the city by history gives New York an advantage which is continuing. It could be lost the way Rome lost its advantage in 300. It could be lost by other cities. But New York still persists because it is a place of invention and energy.
You can tell a lot about a city and its people by the buildings that dominate its skyline, whether that's a church steeple, the mega office building, the half-empty luxury apartment tower, or a true icon. Each stands as a monument of its era. Our buildings tell us something fundamental about who we are and what we prioritise. That's the case all over the world, but nowhere is it clearer than in New York City. We may dislike new buildings when they first appear, but the fact is the city doesn't belong to one person, one time, or even one building. It's constantly changing, constantly evolving, exactly as it should be. New York is never finished. Ground Zero is one of the most challenging construction sites there's ever been. In the wake of 9/11, everyone agreed that something had to be done, but no one could agree on exactly what. The resulting skyscraper that now stands alongside the memorial on the site is an almost reluctant American icon. It's a building that does a bit of everything that everyone wanted, whether that was projecting strength or appearing elegant, acting as a symbolic landmark or offering premium office space. It's a skyscraper built of compromise, an icon by committee. The future of Ground Zero was a topic that everyone had thoughts on. Many felt that rebuilding should focus on a dedicated memorial, but there were also some pretty big economic issues that couldn't be avoided, like the 2.7 million square metres of Manhattan real estate that no longer existed. The responsibility for rebuilding split three ways. The site was owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, but the original World Trade Center towers themselves had been leased to private developer Larry Silverstein in the summer of 2001. Then, after 9/11, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, or LMDC, was formed to distribute more than $10 billion in federal funds to rebuild downtown Manhattan. From the outset, there was no true single client for the site, and no power structure for decision-making. There were other forces too, like then New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who took office in January 2002, and State Governor George Pataki. Pataki, Silverstein and the Port Authority wanted to rebuild all of the office space that had been destroyed, but found themselves struggling to convince the public, who felt that what should be a memorial site was being overly commercialised. Enter the 2002 design competition, where 9 architecture firms were invited to submit master plan ideas in an attempt to get people excited about a site that respected past events, but also included real estate. Studio Libeskind won this competition with a plan to push the site beyond its commercial purpose. In his own words, Daniel Libeskind set out to create a space for people, not just corporations, proposing skyscrapers that would bow towards the site of the original World Trade Center towers, where a new memorial would be built. Crowning everything would be New York's new tallest building, a structure that would rise to a symbolic height of 1,776 feet, nodding to the year of American independence. The public fell in love with the idea, and Pataki dubbed it the Freedom Tower. But that's where things got even more complicated. In the competition, city officials had asked architects to design buildings in an effort to help communicate and sell their ideas. But that's all it was. It was never intended for Libeskind to design and build the Freedom Tower. He was overseeing the wider master plan. Larry Silverstein ignored Libeskind's tower proposal, as he was technically entitled to, and appointed David Childs of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill to design a building for that part of the site. What happened then was pretty tense all round. After some negotiating, Libeskind let Childs take over the role of architect of the Freedom Tower and agreed to meaningfully collaborate. Libeskind sent architects into Childs' office to watch what was happening. Childs developed a design with more floor space and a shorter spire. Libeskind asked Pataki to override this. Eventually, the two architects both compromised and merged their designs, and Libeskind later sued Silverstein for unpaid fees relating to his early work on the project. Finally, in 2003, a new tower was unveiled to the public. Many in the architecture world were relieved it didn't look like a camel, that is, a horse designed by committee, but others criticised several unresolved aspects of the design, and all the while, the awkward project continued. Then, in May 2005, sensing the public's unease, another New York force got involved. Donald Trump sponsored a plan to get the original towers rebuilt, but in a slightly taller, stronger, and better way.
We want to rebuild the World Trade Center as the World Trade Center, but better. A little bit taller, a lot stronger, just plain better.
The idea was never an officially recognised design, more a protest campaign that gave a voice to those who didn't like the plans on the table, and it never went anywhere. In June 2005, the tower was redesigned again, this time in response to the New York Police Department requesting changes so it could become the safest building in the world. The new design shed many of the bolder and more ambitious elements seen in earlier concepts, and the building instead evolved into a somewhat pedestrian and inoffensive skyscraper, the kind you'd take home to meet your mum. It had no windows for the first 50 metres, and its concrete base was clad in a shatterproof glass, to an extent disconnecting the tower from the very site it was there to anchor. Afraid they'd scare off potential tenants with a name as audacious as Freedom Tower, the new rebranded, redesigned One World Trade Center finally broke ground in 2006 and began to rise above the city. Around the building's huge concrete core, a beefed-up steel frame was constructed, designed to redistribute loads if columns were to fail. Unfortunately, the compromises didn't stop at design stage. During construction, the tower's spire wasn't properly finished. In 2011, due to costs, maintenance and safety issues, it was stripped back from a triangular-clad architectural feature to an exposed steel antenna, but it still rose to 1,776 feet, achieving the height part of Libeskind's master plan, while compromising on the form it took to get there. Finally, in 2014, 13 years on from 9/11, the $3.8 billion skyscraper completed, rising 104 stories above Manhattan to become the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. The original World Trade Center towers were also marred in controversy. Their construction was met with lawsuits, and they were criticised as being unimaginative when they first completed in 1970. One reviewer said they looked like the boxes that the Empire State and Chrysler buildings had been delivered in. And yet, over time, they became synonymous with New York, an awe-inspiring architectural ode to the city's capitalist ambitions. They became American icons. David Charles described how he wanted to capture this simplicity in his design for the new World Trade Center. In terms of aesthetics, many agree that he largely accomplishes this. His design is geometrically pleasing and uncomplicated, and it catches the light in some spectacular ways. But it's also criticised for being too generic. It bears a striking similarity to the New York Stock Exchange Tower proposed in 1996 and the Northeast Asia Trade Tower in South Korea. One architect even alleged that Skidmore, Owings and Merrill had copied the tower's design from his 1999 student thesis project. In reality, the project always presented a pretty impossible task regardless of who its architect or decision makers were. Where some wanted a memorial, others wanted a commercial hub. Where some wanted a strong building, others wanted an elegant one. In the end, everyone got a little bit of what they wanted, and the overall result felt exactly like that. Writing just before the building's opening in 2014, the Chicago Tribune's then architecture critic Blair Kamin said that the tower signalled the rebirth of the city, while also feeling set apart from it. Its standoffishness a byproduct of Ground Zero's underlying conflict between remembrance and renewal. Some have argued that a longer passage of time before rebuilding would have allowed for the construction of a more architecturally daring skyscraper. But New York's skyline was broken and it needed to be fixed. Our buildings are all a product of their context, and One World Trade Center is what emerged from an horrific event and the emotive, power-confused determination to remember and rebuild that ensued afterwards. In that sense, it's the only building that could have risen from the site, and it's now part of the fabric of New York. Just as the original towers became synonymous with the city over time, the new skyscraper is already held in greater affection today than it was when it opened less than 7 years ago. Its appearance across pop culture normalising its final form. Time will be this building's fairest critic, and the next generation may conclude that the trade-offs and compromises of One World Trade Center ultimately speak more powerfully to the challenges of this site than anything an architect could plan. New York, New York. Home to America's biggest buildings, its largest transit system, and the highest concentration of billionaires anywhere in the world.
Here, money runs everything.
Down on the ground, the city is bursting at the seams with a relentless entrepreneurialism. Whether it's multi-million-dollar boardroom brawls, bidding wars on exclusive apartments, or just hustling to pay the ever-rising rents. But high above it all lies a market that's hidden in the clouds, one that doesn't really adhere to the standard rules of real estate or engineering.
Welcome to Billionaires Row.
Home to some of the most tall and slender buildings in the world.
9-figure deals, pencil-thin towers, and cutthroat brokers. New York's Billionaires Row is construction at its most extreme.
These insane skyscrapers are what you get when you combine super small plots of land, restrictive zoning laws, amazing engineering advancements, money, and sheer willpower. They break almost every mould and now stand as marvels of modern design.
But even among this new forest of Supertall luxury, there's one building that stands out from the rest and creates a genre all on its own. It's not the most eye-catching skyscraper on the block, but its story is unlike any we've told before.
220 Central Park South is really the outlier on the Billionaires Row corridor.
The building that everyone who's a billionaire has to live in.
These are helicopter people. Their feet don't touch the ground.
There was no need for any marketing, and then it just took on a life of its own.
The two most expensive homes to ever sell in the United States have one major thing in common. They were both apartments at 220 Central Park South.
It is the world's most profitable condo building.
220 Central Park South has it all. Developer clashes, insane engineering, extreme wealth, ruthless power, foreign money, and backdoor deals. This is how a little-known skyscraper quietly became the crown jewel of Billionaires Row. The skyscraper made New York. When it was developed, this ancient island was covered in greenery, and if it had stayed low-rise, it probably wouldn't have amounted to much.
But these extraordinary towers have let it continuously increase its area and welcome millions of people and businesses. Each shaped by the powerful economic and geographic context of its time, the city's skyscrapers now stand as silent chapter markers in its ever-evolving story.
At the turn of the 20th century, things were no different. New York's population was booming, and so was its development. That ushered in a new era of construction, one that lured in wealthy residents with luxurious co-ops for sale. Think ornate facades, exclusive amenities, and a cutthroat application process ruled by notoriously stuffy co-op boards. And so began the carousel of New York's It building, a coveted status symbol marked by steel and stone. One of the earliest stood at 834 Fifth Avenue on the Upper East Side. Completed in 1931 and home to Lawrence Rockefeller, it was once described as the most pedigreed building on the snobbiest street in the country's most real estate-obsessed city. Also built in the 30s was 740 Park Avenue, once home to John D. Rockefeller. For nearly a century, these roads right alongside Central Park have been the most coveted corridor in New York City. Then, around the mid-2000s, another building started turning heads. Right across the park stood 15 Central Park West, a two-sectioned asymmetrical tower with a striking limestone facade. Only this one was a condo, not a co-op. That meant buyers no longer needed a legacy name to get their application noticed. A massive bank account was enough to get you in the door. 15 Central Park West drew in CEOs, celebrities, tech executives, and even the daughter of a Russian oligarch who bought the penthouse for $88 million. Then, around the start of the 2010s, something changed. We saw not just one building, but an entire street of skyscrapers become the city's new place to be.
I'm out here on Billionaires Row, the most expensive street in America.
This is what $54.6 million buys you in New York City.
Kicking off with 157 in 2014 and then 432 Park Avenue the following year, this series of super tall skyscrapers lined up along the southern edge of Central Park. Now, that's impressive given there are hardly any sites left in this congested corner of what is one of the world's most congested cities. With only small parcels of land available, developers found themselves under pressure to maximise floor area and park views in order to drive a return. A pressure that they passed on down to their engineers. The result was the rise of a whole new architectural style. Meet the super slender skyscraper, an elegant 21st century solution to some very 21st century constraints. Width to height ratios were pushed to the extreme, foundations went to a different league, and super strong concrete cores were paired with stabilisation tricks like dampers and open floors that help manage intense wind loads. This new breed of building is seriously thin. 111W57, the world's thinnest skyscraper, has a width to height ratio of 1 to 24. Compare that to 1 Madison or 520 Park Avenue, buildings already considered slender, and you get the picture.
Engineers had broken a frontier and a phenomenon emerged. The ability to buy a newly built apartment in a super tall skyscraper with uninterrupted views of Central Park. And the world's wealthiest people snapped them up.
Over the last couple of decades, wealth inequality, particularly in the US, has been widening. Today, the top 1% of Americans own a much bigger share of the total wealth than the middle 40%. And if you zoom out and take a look at the wider world, you'll see that the richest 10% of people control a whopping 76% of the wealth.
Essentially, that means there's now more money in the hands of fewer people, and many of those people are looking to secure and grow their wealth even more by investing in what's long been one of their safest bets: luxury real estate.
The new Billionaires Row that emerged from all this is big, bold, and architecturally impressive. It now dominates the world's most famous skyline and has forever changed the shape of it. But you won't find the most technically challenging and financially successful building in the area among the acres of photos or beautiful drone footage that's afforded to the glass Supertalls. That's because it was an altogether more secretive affair that emerged on this little site right here.
So this is it? This is
it.
Billionaires Row.
What do you notice about it?
It's just all so thin, isn't it?
Look around you. This is all glassy edifices, flashy, and then you've got this somewhat nondescript building. Besides how skinny it is, there's nothing really that jumps out at you.
Hitan Samtani co-authored the definitive story on 220 Central Park South at The Real Deal. We worked closely with him throughout our research to help us tell this story.
This project is a totem for everything that is decadent and depraved about New York City real estate. It has it all. Billionaire battles, trench warfare, extreme engineering, class warfare, billionaires sort of vying for each other's properties. It is a level of complexity and narrative intricacy that I've never seen in a project before.
He connected us to Pam Liebman, head of the Corcoran Group, one of the leading real estate brokerages in the country, which oversaw several sales at the property.
I love real estate because it changes every day. You learn something new every day. You probably work more than you would in a regular job, but it's very rewarding, fulfilling, and I just love it.
220 Central Park South got off to a quiet but promising start. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, it blew everyone out the water.
4 full floors of a new condo off Central Park for $238 million. That makes it the most expensive home ever sold in the United States.
Illinois' richest man, Ken Griffin.
Ken Griffin coming in at number 1, wealth, $35 billion.
Enter Ken Griffin.
Ken Griffin is one of those few people in America who has both the money and the ego to try to shape cities to his will.
This Ken is one of the world's richest men. The Citadel CEO and hedge fund manager is no stranger to extreme wealth and success. But he set a new standard for conspicuous consumption when he walked into 220 Central Park South and bought the most expensive residential property in US history.
Real estate people thought, this is great. This just shows you that people are willing to spend this kind of money in New York City, and this is a building that's really making a statement.
Now, Griffin already owned several high-end properties around the world, but this became the crown jewel of his portfolio. He later went on to buy 2 additional units within the same building. Ken Griffin's purchase put it in a league above even the most exclusive skyscrapers. But hold on a minute, how did this even happen? Well, the truth is, to really understand that, we've got to take you guys back to where it all began.
The site's called YouTube.com. It's kind of like Flickr for videos. College students across the country are, quote, Facebooking.
We have so much data about what people are doing.
When you stand for your liberty, we will stand with you.
Hurricane Katrina barreled ashore.
The breakup of Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston.
This is the new iPod Nano.
It's early 2005, and rumours of a US real estate bubble are looming. Then there's the New York City housing market. During that same year, a potential deal came across the desk of a development firm called Claret Group. It had 3 of the main ingredients for successful real estate: location, location, and location. The offer was to buy out an unimpressive 20-story rental building that had a super impressive address. 220 Central Park South could offer sweeping views of the park if a newer and taller tower were put on the site. At the same time, the existing property was nearly half vacant, but still home to some 47 rent-stabilised tenants, people who are protected from sharp increases in their monthly payments.
It was really a smattering of the average New Yorker, from wealthy people to just your middle class people. You had everything from a professor of gerontology to a record producer, actually quite a prominent record producer. He actually occupied the penthouse, and I believe he paid $1,200 a month in rent.
Claret Group saw the opportunity and ran with it. But to gain approval from the state and move forward with a whole new building, they needed money, and lots of it. And with remaining tenants on the site, it wasn't exactly a straightforward process.
There is this particular quirk of law that if you want to demolish a rent-stabilized building, you have to essentially show that you have the financing in place to build something new. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem.
Unable to secure a loan, Claret Group instead sought out a financial partner. Enter Vornado Realty Trust, led by Mr. Steve Roth.
We are a public company, so public, private, sucking up to the public companies.
He's an absolute buccaneer. even though he runs a public company.
His standard is the highest standard I've ever seen.
At that point, the real estate investment group had a market cap of over $10 billion.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
In August 2005, Claret brought Vornado on as a 90% equity partner in the project and ultimately closed the deal at $137 million. But the story doesn't end there. Before they could build what is now 220 Central Park South, work needed to be done, including tearing down the building that was there before and buying enough air rights to build taller, a task that fell to Claret.
Yep, you heard that right. Here in New York, it's not just the buildings for sale, but the air above them too.
Developers can snatch up air rights around their properties and combine them to comply with development limits in the area and build even taller than they could before. The process can take years, but it's what's allowed 220 Central Park South and much of Billionaires Row to rise so high while preventing close neighbours from blocking those awesome views. Now, before you demolish a building, it's polite to ask people to step out of it first. Here, that meant buying out tenants, and to no one's surprise, the residents of 220 were not so keen on moving out, so the firm faced an expensive battle.
I believe in the end, they were paid between $1.3 and $1.6 million each to leave. Right, that's a good chunk of money for the average New Yorker.
The project took so long and cost so much more than expected that Claret's upside was essentially wiped out. Vornado wrote them a check for their troubles and assumed full control. Building a skyscraper like this is a marathon, and not everyone has the stamina to last.
Stephen Roth is known primarily as an office landlord. He took a really significant interest in 220 because the site for it was directly opposite his own office.
Catherine Clark is a journalist and author who became known as a kind of sleuth of Billionaires Row, uncovering the big buyers on the block.
And so he would look out his window and he would see that site and he would think, that's the best site in New York. I need to build a condo there.
So far, so New York. But just as this legal battle was unfolding, a Trojan horse had stealthily entered the field of play.
Enter Gary Barnett, the founder of Extel Developments.
He is a very prominent developer in New York, kind of loves complexity, is somewhat addicted to complexity and messy, decades-long projects.
Around the time Roth was facing resident lawsuits in 2005, Barnett bought a partial stake in a 13-year lease at a basement parking garage directly below 220 Central Park South. He then went on to acquire an additional small parcel right in the middle of the Vornado development site. Why, you may ask? Well, Barnett was the owner of a nearby development site between 57th and 58th Street, and he hopes to build his own luxury property there, complete with Central Park views and their accompanying price tags. No views means less money, so when he heard that a building at the 220 site might go up, he swung into action and set up a bargaining chip to use against Vornado in the future. By the time Vornado wanted to clear the site in 2011, Barnett pulled out his ace card.
So Vornado find this all out. What's their reaction? I guess they're not happy, right?
They're not happy at all. They're trying to sue the hell out of these guys and trying to get them out of there.
Finally, in 2013, Vornado folded and agreed to pay $194 million for the tiny Extel-owned parcel and its air rights in the middle of their development site. That's a whopping $1,400 a foot, more than twice the going rate at the time. And in an arrangement to preserve each other's views, Extel moved what would eventually become the mammoth Central Park Tower to the east, while Vornado shifted 220 slightly to the west. Extel's Supertall Skyscraper also introduced a cantilever that extended 8.5 metres out above the Art Students League of New York building for the small payout of $32 million, thus ensuring more units could keep their views of the park. At last, Vornado could move forward with its plans.
Or so they thought. Construction here in New York is anything but cheap, even for a titan of a developer like Vornado. So the firm reached out to someone with even deeper pockets.
I owe the Bank of China a lot of money. Right? I am in the suck-up business to the Bank of China.
To build 220 Central Park South, Roth borrowed a cool $600 million from the Bank of China in 2014, followed by an extra $350 million a year later. By this point, 220 Central Park South had been years in the making. It had secured developers, funding, and cleared a plot of land in busy Midtown Manhattan. Now it was time for the fun part, and architect Robert A.M. Stern was hired to handle the design. 220 Central Park South is a truly remarkable feat of construction. Its rectangular form rises 290 metres into the sky, but measures just 16 metres across. That's a width-to-height ratio of 1:18. But to go up, construction teams first had to dig down. Through control blasting and painstaking rock hammering, they excavated 15 metres into the bedrock and installed 3 2.5 metre thick concrete slabs and 142 rock anchors. Working so close to existing buildings, they constantly monitored them to ensure their structures weren't being affected. With the foundations complete, construction crews moved above ground and began constructing the skyscraper's most critical structural element, its spine, the concrete core. Take a look at your standard skyscraper floor plan and you'll always see the core in the middle. It means your structural beams that hold each of the floors up can run out to the perimeter columns and don't have far to go. It's also where you'll always see the elevator shafts, services, stairs and bathrooms. It makes for a good vertical access route up through your structure, and it means that people in your tower are all going to get natural light and a nice view out. But there was only one view that mattered at 220 Central Park South. The Real Deal got a hold of the floor plans, and we've recreated them to show exactly how wealth is shaping engineering decisions in this building. To maximise saleable area, the core was pushed to the southern perimeter. Any interior columns were eliminated to create an open, flexible floor plan in the apartments, and that now much larger gap between the core and the northern perimeter was bridged with a 28cm thick concrete slab. Towers like this are subject to extreme wind loads and a phenomenon called vortex shedding, where differing air currents can pull up the structure, causing it to sway. To counteract this, 220 includes an 1100-ton swinging weight in a space near its summit, known as a tuned mass damper. With 118 apartments, the 220 project combines a shorter 18-storey structure known as the Villa, with a much taller 70-storey tower behind it. But precast or hand-set limestone wouldn't work for a building this tall, so a limestone curtain wall system was developed instead. Unlike glass, this material is opaque, and that allowed engineers to hide more spandrel beams behind it around the perimeter of the tower. When combined with the shear walls between the smaller apartments on the lower levels, this approach helped further improve the building's overall strength and stiffness. Finally, an unusual mega-frame concept was adopted. This grouped the main perimeter columns on the northern facade into 4. The columns were much larger, but they helped to maximise those Central Park views. Another illustration of how almost every inch of this building has been shaped by the market it's targeting. The tower was expensive, to say the least. We couldn't get our hands on official figures, but Steve Roth claimed Vornado was spending around $5,000 per square foot on construction. That eye-watering sum would be way above the circa $3,000 that other Billionaires Row towers spent, and quite clearly in a whole different galaxy to your average walk-up apartment. It's a budget that gets you all kinds of things, from oak flooring and marble cladding to saltwater pools. In total, the building cost around $1.5 billion. Roth went big, confident that he could up the sale price, and it worked. Vornado went on to drive more than $3 billion in sales. Roth had built the most profitable condo in the world. But to get returns like that, you've got to think outside the box. As you might have realised, there are only so many people in the world who can afford an apartment like this. even on Billionaires Row, a $238 million sale is out of the ordinary.
These are helicopter people. Their feet don't touch the ground. They go from private school to charity gala to penthouse, right? They're not interacting with the average city dweller. So they're living in this different world, and often developers are thinking about them and building for them.
We just had enough people coming to us, and then it just took on a life of its own. And we did it very quietly. People signed NDAs. We invited co-brokers in.
There are 8 billion people on our planet, but a little over 2,600 of them are billionaires. So right from the start, there's an incredibly small demographic of buyers who can realistically afford these units. Now, not everyone in the building is a billionaire, but it's a good place to start. Cut to May 2015.
White and gold or blue and black.
We are going to make our country
have wage equality once and for all and equal rights for women.
For the last time on a television program, thank you and good night.
220 Central Park South had just launched sales, and Roth hopped on an earnings call to reveal the big news.
In just 6 short weeks, without any advertising, marketing, or outreach whatsoever, we already have commitments for over $1.1 billion, representing about 1/3 of the building. So 1/3 of the building is now sold.
Now, hang on a minute. No advertising, no marketing, not even a website, and yet over $1 billion in sales in just over a month. How did he do this? After all, your typical luxury condo market is, well, a bit more flashy when it comes to getting the word out. Steve Roth, on the other hand, had gone in a very different direction.
Stephen Roth treated that building less like a condo and more like his own personal country club. So he took a really significant interest in who was buying there, who would be allowed to come and see the units. So it created this velvet rope effect where, if you weren't allowed to be in there, you wanted to be in there even more. And that really sent the values skyrocketing.
Steve knew what he was doing. He treated that building as though he was going to live in every apartment. So most developers, when they're planning it, they start to value engineer it. He did the opposite. He would add things to make it better. So he created this vision of this is a building me, a billionaire, would live in, not me, him. So there was right off the bat this big feeling of comfort from all these other buyers that if Steve's in charge, this is going to be different.
Wealthy domestic purchasers were dropping tens of millions on units. The CEO of Paramount Group paid $33.5 million. The founder of RL Capital got a place for $26.2 million. Even Sting became an official Englishman in New York when he nabbed one of the penthouses for $65.7 million. After years of plotting, planning and persistence, 220 Central Park South had become the creme de la creme of Billionaires Row. Like so many things in life, reaching the top gets you noticed. And just as the team behind the Supertall celebrated their success, the city of New York began to pay attention.
It's not easy to find something nearly all New Yorkers agree on, but when it comes to rent...
What we need here is affordable, permanent housing.
The average monthly rent has jumped to a record high of nearly $5,600.
Is it going to get any better anytime soon? What's the future look like?
The record-breaking apartment in the sky stirred up debate among those experiencing the shocking wealth disparity back here on the ground.
Some politicians used the news to resurface the proposed tax on owners with second homes valued over $5 million. A move that would generate millions of dollars for the city. But they're struggling to keep up with Billionaires Row.
Legislators are deeply steeped in the intricacies of New York City real estate. Billionaires Row is the essence of trophy real estate. We don't know the level of taxes they pay. So if they don't live here, they're not contributing to the same degree as the rest of us toward essential city services.
A pied-à-terre tax would be a small surcharge on these properties, a move that some felt to be entirely reasonable since so many were just investment vehicles that often sat empty. The tax had actually been pushed before, back in 2014, but it was always a long shot.
Obviously, I think that's ridiculous. These are people who spend a lot of money and put a ton of money into our city and fund so much of what makes New York what it is. You would never want to antagonize or alienate these people. And we already have significant taxes when people buy these kind of apartments. If you think about what the mansion tax and city and state transfer taxes were on this building, I mean, it was big. Very, very big. Thank you, Steve. The city should be thanking him.
Ultimately, it was lobbied against, and lawmakers dropped it in favour of a newly enacted mansion tax, an additional charge on properties valued over $1 million.
Having wealthy people in our city is a good thing if it contributes to the lifeblood of our economy. I'm not certain, though, that always is the case.
This building speaks of so much. Incredible engineering, a rising wealth gap, the relentless ambition to maintain and grow that wealth among the world's richest people, the complicated relationship between government and real estate, and above all else, the power of money in a city that's constantly reinventing itself. Like a diamond, formed under immense pressure in the perfect conditions and at exactly the right time, 220 Central Park South has risen as a monument to all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
This city's buildings have always adapted to whatever history's thrown at them. They've always responded and evolved to help New York keep pace. We saw it with the construction of the first skyscrapers here in the early part of the 20th century, with the construction of the World Trade Center in the 1970s, and then the rebuilding of the World Trade Center after 9/11. We saw it with the way developers built skyscrapers over a light rail yard, and most recently we're seeing it in the form of Billionaires Row. But even among all that, the story of 220 Central Park South sets an extreme new bar. Even among the engineering awe of Billionaires Row, it stands out for the most extreme of reasons. What's struck me most about coming here this time and covering this aspect of Billionaires Row is how I'm in one city, but I'm talking about two completely different worlds. The people of New York are struggling to find affordable housing, they're struggling with a cost of living crisis, and yet up there in those skyscrapers are people living a very different life.
This exact combination of greed, wealth, design, litigation, it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, not even close. New York City is the only place this could happen.
I don't think we're going to see another phenomenon like Billionaires Row for quite some time. We saw that narrative play out, and the people who got in a little bit too late lost a lot of money, had a lot of trouble, and we're not seeing the same hunger to build that ultra luxury real estate anymore, at least at that scale.
History's littered with examples of cities that became so great, so renowned, but then ultimately pushed too far. And I can't help but feel, being on the ground here and digging into this story, talking to people involved in it and those living a normal life in New York City, that this place, this city that has so much allure and that I love and so many others love so much, might be going the same way.
There's a big problem in the Big Apple, and it's not the only city facing this dilemma. You've heard of Italy's Leaning Tower of Pisa, and you can't forget San Francisco's tilting Millennium Tower. But did you know that New York City has its very own slanted skyscraper? That's right, the skyline that never stops evolving has developed a bit of a predicament. This is One Seaport, or 161 Maiden Lane, 60 stories of prime real estate on Manhattan's eastern waterfront. At first glance, it may look like any other construction project downtown, but look a lot closer and you'll find it's actually leaning by 8 centimeters or 3 inches to the north. Now that may not seem like a lot, but it's enough to leave a brand new skyscraper abandoned before it's even opened. Construction's in a stalemate and no one wants to admit fault.
It was supposed to have beautiful south and east facing views, and it's turned into one of those symbols of like what can go wrong in a project.
With a busy highway on one side, a city packed full of high-rises and busy New Yorkers on the other, intense media scrutiny and millions of dollars in real estate deals at stake, the pressure is on to fix the tower before it's too late. So what exactly caused it to lean, and will it ever stand up straight again? It's no secret that New York City's real estate is both expensive and competitive, and when it's parkside or waterfront, the price tags and prestige get even higher.
The nation's largest rental market saw the median monthly rent tick up.
161 Maiden Lane was going to be no exception. Overlooking the East River in downtown Manhattan, the 204-metre tower was set to be the tallest residential skyscraper on the eastern waterfront, with apartment sales ranging from $1 to $7 million US. But after several construction delays and accidents, it's safe to say the skyscraper has, well, had a string of bad luck. Today, construction is stalled and the building only has about half of its windows and finishings, so it's a bit of a blemish on the New York skyline. There have been issues throughout its entire development, but it's the allegations around the most important step of construction that are generating the most interest: the building's foundation. Now, for any non-engineers out there, that's the part of a skyscraper that sits at and below ground level and provides a firm base for it to rise on. Essentially, before you build up, you've got to build down. But assembling a skyscraper in New York City is unlike anywhere else.
Because you're developing in such a hyper-dense environment, there are certain constraints you have that you wouldn't have in, let's say, Dallas, where you have a lot of land to play with. Here you're building, it's all vertical engineering.
Now, to really understand the allegations around this building's foundations, we need to get you up to speed on a few things. So buckle up for another little round of Engineering 101 with the B1M. Foundations are complicated, and we're going to massively simplify here. Please don't go building your own foundations off the back of this video. The basic job of a foundation is to provide a firm base for a building to stand on and to transfer the vertical weight or load of that building down onto planet Earth. Sometimes that can be done onto great, strong rock or soil at ground level. Sometimes you have to go a little deeper, and sometimes you have to go very deep indeed. Every construction site in the world is unique, so things vary. Small buildings like homes might use block or strip footings, that's basically shallow cubes or strips of concrete with a slab on top. Other small structures might use raft foundations, and very big buildings often use a form of piling. That's where steel-reinforced concrete columns are driven or poured into the ground to reach good material or bedrock deep below, transferring the weight of the building down. Sometimes that's done with a basement where piles are used to form the walls. Sometimes there are piles that go beyond a basement. Sometimes there are pools or whole subway stations down there, but you get the idea. Like we said, not easy. Now, in major cities with lots of tall buildings around, kinda like New York, you can't just go digging a hole wherever you like. With all those heavy buildings putting pressure on the ground, any excavation would take away some of the earth that their weight is resting on. It would interrupt their so-called angle of incidence. To avoid the risk of buildings collapsing, teams digging basements need to create retaining walls first. That can be done by driving sheets of steel into the ground, or creating a wall of piles first and then excavating, bracing the open hole as you go. Now, at this point, we could bore you with a lovely bit of top-down basement construction, but we've done that before, and to be honest, it's not really relevant. The main thing to take away from all this, as you've hopefully gathered, is that foundation engineering is governed by one very important material: soil.
Soil has a bearing capacity. That is referring to how much poundage of force it can handle. First, that soil gets tested. Definitely they have a parking lot or something, and they dug down into the ground and they have tested the soil. Then the engineer that has designed the building is considering the weight of the building, is considering the weight of the furniture, weight of the people, weight of the glass, also weird forces like wind force.
If a soil is too weak or not up to standard, it can be treated to improve its strength, sometimes by adding chemicals or by mixing in other material. But the more common approach is just to go for the more expensive but often much more reliable piles. At 161 Maiden Lane, Pizzarotti, the building contractor, sued the developer, Fortis Property Group, saying it cut corners. According to the lawsuit, they took the soil improvement route rather than the piling route like many other buildings had done nearby. Pizzarotti claims that details of the method used were not revealed to it before it started building the tower. As construction continued, this allegedly made the building improperly settle and caused it to tilt roughly 8 centimetres. There's been a lot of legal drama over who is ultimately to blame, and the case is still being battled out in the courtroom. Pizzarotti claims the building will continue to lean if the foundation isn't fixed, which could create a risk of falling facade panels, corrosion, or even elevators failing to remain vertical. As a result, the company claims it terminated its contract with Fortis. Fortis acknowledged the building had what it called an alignment issue, but said it wasn't a cause for safety concerns. The company also said Pizzarotti never actually terminated its contract and instead continued working. We reached out to both parties for comment on all this, but didn't get a response.
If the lean was caused by a force that came from the wind, it was acting on a skeleton, empty, and it was able to push it that way. The moment you put glass on that, what do you have now? You have a ship sail. Collect more force from that wind, and it will move further. And if you have something broken, especially in the case of concrete breaks, it's done.
This could explain why there were reports that some of the glass facade had appeared to be removed in 2020. While that could be a temporary fix, a long-term plan still hasn't been laid out, largely because the case is still being fought out in court.
The leaning of the building is a symptom of the problem. So all the articles I have read, they are not saying what the problem is. If you don't know the problem, you cannot give a remedy for it. So I really can't. If the problem is a broken foundation, you're done. You have to dismantle, refix the foundation, and go for it.
Over in San Francisco, engineers have proposed fixing Millennium Tower's lean with underpinning, installing 18 new piles into the building's foundation deep underground. Now, underpinning is a very common procedure, especially on domestic properties, but it's extremely challenging on a skyscraper. Fortis claims all it would take to fix 161 Maiden Lane is a simple redesign of the glass facade. But until we know the root of the problem, we won't really be able to work out the best way to fix it. To be very clear, and especially for those nearby, no one's claiming the building's on the verge of collapsing right now, and it's understood to be in a safe condition. But the longer it sits abandoned, the more expensive it gets, and nobody wants to foot that bill. According to The Real Deal, nearly all prospective buyers have pulled out of their deals, and hundreds of millions of dollars have already been sunk into the construction work. It remains to be seen if this leaning tower can ever stand straight again. In the meantime, it sits unfinished on the city's skyline. For all of the drama of this building, countless other projects around the world proceed without any issues every day. It's a powerful reminder of just how important the construction industry's work really is, and how billions of us take it for granted. With its iconic landmarks, towering skyscrapers, and global appeal, Manhattan's been the defining borough of New York City for over 120 years. But with a high cost of living and land on the island now scarce, nearby Brooklyn is experiencing a modern-day renaissance, attracting developers, businesses, and people to the area, all culminating in a tower that will transform its skyline. Set to become New York's 9th tallest building when it completes in 2022, 9 DeKalb Avenue will be the tallest structure in the city outside of Manhattan, and the first super tall skyscraper ever built in Brooklyn. To really understand what a skyscraper this tall is doing in Brooklyn rather than rising in Manhattan, you need to get the history of the two boroughs. Established as an independent city in the 17th century, Brooklyn was long seen as New York's twin. but with the only means of transportation between the two being via boat, day-to-day interaction between them was limited. When the Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883, it was met with increasing calls to consolidate the two cities with surrounding towns, in an effort to maintain New York's place as the United States' largest and most important city against a rapidly growing Chicago. In 1898, the cities of New York, which at the time included the area known as the Bronx, and Brooklyn, along with the western Queens County and Staten Island, came together to form the 5 boroughs that we know today as New York City. The completion of the Williamsburg Bridge, Subway Line and Manhattan Bridge further improved connections between Brooklyn and Manhattan, giving Midtown and Downtown access to a much larger workforce and enabling Manhattan to become the de facto commercial heart of the city. Brooklyn maintained its own downtown core, and with the majority of commercial investment going into Manhattan, the area remained a civic centre with a low-rise commercial presence for almost a century. But as Manhattan's cost of living continued to rise, Brooklyn became a sought-after location for those seeking the one thing the island could no longer offer: space. Despite being steadily gentrified since the 1960s, it wasn't until 2004, when Brooklyn's downtown was rezoned to permit denser housing, that the area truly transformed. With an influx of residents and high-rise developments, Brooklyn's downtown quickly developed into a 24/7 community, where people could live, work and play, while still being close to Manhattan. The wave of change spilled over into surrounding neighbourhoods, and Brooklyn Heights, Dumbo and Williamsburg all underwent their own transformations. Offering lower rents and a stark contrast to the purely commercial cores of Manhattan, Brooklyn began attracting entrepreneurs and startups, becoming a thriving new tech hub. By 2013, Dumbo was home to 25% of all New York-based tech firms. With over $9 billion in private investment, Brooklyn evolved into one of the most desirable and in-demand areas of the city. With such a rapid rise in prominence, it wasn't long before plans were submitted for a landmark new tower that would add Brooklyn onto the world's most famous skyline. At 335 metres, 9 DeKalb Avenue will stand over 110 metres higher than Brooklyn's next tallest skyscraper, and dominate the borough's cityscape from all directions. Designed by SHOP Architects, 9 DeKalb Avenue marks the third collaboration between the firm and high-end developer JDS Development Group, after the American Copper Buildings and the super slender 111 West 57th Street, known as 111 W57 on Billionaires Row. Unlike the world's thinnest skyscraper, which due to its small footprint was only able to offer luxury, high-end residences, 9 DeKalb Avenue will include retail and office space as well as a commercial gym alongside 575 apartments, 20% of which will be affordable rentals. Incorporating the historic Dime Savings Bank into its podium, 9 DeKalb Avenue's unusual shape nods to the bank's hexagonal floor plate. Its stepped-back profile is reminiscent of the style made famous by many of the city's skyscrapers in the 1930s, and the building will be clad in bronze, stainless steel and stone. Making use of its large triangular site, the tower is set back from Albee Square, allowing the Dime Savings Bank to retain its prominence on the streetscape and creating a rooftop terrace for residents. Construction first began in mid-2018, and the tower was just beginning to rise above ground when the pandemic first sent the world into lockdown in March 2020. With many predicting an economic downturn, some feared 9 DeKalb Avenue might become a victim of the recession. Despite the uncertainty, construction continued, workers began installing the facade at the end of 2020, and the building has now risen beyond its halfway mark. Floor by floor, 9 DeKalb Avenue is now making its historic entrance onto New York City's skyline. And the first Supertall building outside of Manhattan is likely to ignite similar projects in Brooklyn, particularly as the cost of living forces many to look beyond the island. The city that never sleeps is also always shifting, always evolving, and always offering something new. These huge new skyscrapers in Manhattan are built on a specially designed platform over a live rail yard. The massive Hudson Yards development is everything New York, big, bold, and outrageously ambitious. At $25 billion, the new neighbourhood is the largest and most expensive private real estate development in US history. It's transformed Manhattan's iconic skyline and pushed the bounds of engineering, generating tens of thousands of new construction jobs. But it's also garnered a reputation as an elite district in a city already marked by stark economic inequalities. And it's only half complete. There are big plans for expansion. But the lifeblood of Hudson Yards, luxury real estate, shopping and dining, has been ravaged by the pandemic. As the city tries to recover, the mega development's future is hanging in the balance. Hudson Yards now dominates Western Midtown, and the cluster of gleaming skyscrapers is among the tallest in the city. The Eastern Yard, which opened in 2019, spans West 30th to West 34th Street between 10th and 11th Avenue. The Western Yard, the proposed expansion, will extend the megadevelopment further west over the remaining train tracks. For decades, plans to redevelop the area around the rail yard were devised and dropped. In preparation for New York's bid to host the 2012 Olympics, the city rezoned the area in hopes of building a new stadium and accompanying buildings. The Olympic bid and stadium plans ultimately fell through, but the vision to build an entirely new neighbourhood remained. The winning master plan from related companies and Oxford Properties Group painted a picture of a district built around office buildings, upscale shopping, restaurants, parks, and the arts. High-profile companies like Facebook, HBO and Wells Fargo all signed office deals, and developers said the project should contribute nearly $19 billion a year to New York City's GDP once completed. In 2019, Hudson Yards opened itself up to the public with much fanfare. Celebrities, politicians, architects, developers, a choir, dancers, and even Big Bird were all there for the grand opening. But over the last year, the area hasn't necessarily embodied the grand vision laid out in the master plan. The pandemic has seen office life, shopping, dining, and live performances all put on hold, and criticisms emerged over how the project used tax breaks and government programs to fund itself.
It's not exactly desolate at this point, but it's not vibrant either. I live about a half a mile north of Hudson Yards, and I go everywhere within a half-mile radius except there, because there is really no reason for a person who doesn't live or work there to go there unless they are an ultra-high-end shopper, which I am not. The pandemic really dealt a blow to what was already a risky venture.
The Eastern Yard is home to 1.8 million square feet of residential space, with apartments in the luxury buildings going for millions of dollars. In 2018, there was an affordable housing lottery where New Yorkers could apply to be selected for one of roughly 100 subsidized units if they made between $22,000 and $125,000 a year. Beyond housing, Hudson Yards has also given rise to some new landmarks in the city. The Edge, a triangular observation deck 100 stories in the air, is the tallest in the Western Hemisphere. You can do yoga, sip rosé, or take a photo lying over the glass floor. Back on the ground, the Vessel, designed by Heatherwick Studio, has been a controversial yet undeniably ambitious public installation. And The Shed is a cultural centre with a retractable outer shell that can double the building's footprint when pulled out over the plaza next door. Phase 2 calls for 6.2 million square feet of new development, including residential buildings, an office complex, and a kindergarten to 8th grade school. According to the New York Times, Phase 2 appears to be on hold, as the developers are seeking $2 billion in federal funding to build the 10-acre platform that will serve as the base of the new development. Related, the property's developer has not yet responded to our requests for comment.
And most of the affordable housing in Hudson Yards was supposed to be built in Phase 2. So that is a rationale for completing the project, but I think for the city it's also a lesson to learn that we should never allow the public benefit to come in Phase 2 of a majorly financed public-private development.
Now, as you might have guessed, building an entirely new neighbourhood and some skyscrapers over an active rail yard is not easy. You're not just building a new development on land, you're also building the land itself. The Western Yard will be built on a 10-acre platform similar to the one constructed over the Eastern rail yard. Hundreds of pipes will be drilled into the bedrock between the train tracks and then filled with concrete to create the pile foundations. They'll take the load of everything above and pass it down to the much stronger bedrock beneath the surface soil. Trusses connect sections of the platform where it's not possible to drill into the ground. At some points, the Hudson Yards crew only has an hour or two to bring their rigs to site, drill into the bedrock of the rail yard, and then remove the rigs before the trains come through. Accuracy can come down to a fraction of an inch. Just across Manhattan to the east, parts of Park Avenue were actually built on a similar platform system around Grand Central Terminal.
To build something like this, they have to basically play a giant game of Tetris where you're establishing the pillars in places that are unused by the train lines below.
Working around an active rail yard is a delicate dance, planning construction around train schedules so they can run without disruption. And all those trains generate a lot of heat. A ventilation system of massive fans typically found in jet engines are nestled between the platform and the rail yard to help cool the space. To protect the plants above the rail yard from cooking, a system of tubing helps circulate cooling liquid below the surface. When you're building on tight timeframes over moving trains, there's little room for error, and digital modelling is crucial to making the most of your time on site. It's difficult to put into words the volume of digital information that's generated when building a project like this. If it were all printed out and stacked up, it would probably be another skyscraper in its own right, and a pretty unsustainable one at that. From an engineering and architectural perspective, Hudson Yards is already a modern-day New York City icon. But the success of new developments is really measured by their impact on the lives of the people that live in the area.
What I would like to see is not a decrease in the ambitiousness of our planning programs, but rather to use that ambition to meet the actual social needs of people here. So if we're going to do another project like Hudson Yards, we should be looking at what the needs of people are in terms of housing, in terms of jobs, in terms of open space, and all the rest, and not sort of building for the highest end and assuming that it will trickle down.
With such a huge area of inner city land available for development and near endless money at the team's disposal, Hudson Yards appears to have all the tools it needs to become a vibrant new neighbourhood. But its lasting success can only be determined by the culture and community that grows there. To be truly embraced as a new New York City neighbourhood, Hudson Yards will need to deliver what the people of Manhattan really need, not just what developers think they want. New York is full. So full that it's now building on top of its existing high-rises to create more space. This is One Wall Street, one of the city's oldest skyscrapers. It used to be an office building, but has now been converted into apartments. In doing so, 6 additional floors have been added on top. Adding new floors to a building is clearly not a simple task, let alone doing it on top of a skyscraper in the middle of one of the busiest cities in the world. The average concrete slab in a New York building is 8 inches thick and weighs thousands of pounds. Adding new floors means adding a lot more weight to a structure that it was not designed to cope with. If it's done wrong, it could crush the floors below. This is the story of how engineers overcame immense challenges to bring One Wall Street into the 2020s. It's how New York built on top of an historic skyscraper. It's taken 8 years of construction to convert this Art Deco skyscraper from offices to apartments. It's the largest building in New York City to undergo this type of adaptive reuse. While the exteriors remain mostly the same, the inside of the building has been nearly completely gutted. A total of 566 homes now occupy One Wall Street. Hundreds of new landmark-approved windows were added. The building's mechanical areas, as well as 30 of its elevators, had to be moved from the perimeter to the core, And of course, 6 additional floors were added to the top in a way that wouldn't crush the floors underneath.
There were a lot of challenges. We're engineers, we're tinkers, things we like to work on. This had a lot of those. It was a challenge, but it was nothing insurmountable. My name is Mark Plasciati. I'm a structural engineer. Our involvement started 2014, so it's been almost or essentially a decade's worth of work on the building.
So why did this have to happen? Why did this building have to be gutted and transformed? Well, the nature of our cities is changing. 1 Wall Street occupies a full city block bound by Broadway, Wall Street, New Street and Exchange Place. It's right in the middle of the financial district, the beating capitalist heart of this city. It's where the stock exchange is, the Federal Bank, and One World Trade Center. It's here in this district where legacies are made and lost within a matter of months. A neighbourhood that's seen rapid change in recent years. Demand for office space has dwindled, and demand for housing has skyrocketed. People are looking at these towering office buildings and wondering if they could be put to better use, if people could actually live in them. But the thing is, office buildings aren't designed to be lived in, and converting them into apartments isn't easy. Offices tend to have large floor plates that don't divide into apartments very easily. They often have their plumbing, electricals and elevators in the wrong place, and they don't allow for enough natural light to reach the very centre of the floor plate.
I know that there's some projects going on, and they are actually taking one of these and cutting out a core, like an atrium, so you can actually get the light and air that you need. I am the Director of Architecture and in Design at Maclo Properties. Practiced as an architect for 2 decades before I joined Maclo Properties.
1 Wall Street is among the city's earliest skyscrapers. It was built at the beginning of the 20th century and designed by architect Ralph Walker.
The original building that was completed in 1931, it's such an iconic and significant building in New York City.
The original tower was landmarked by New York City in 1980s, 1990s, something like that. So once it becomes landmarked, you cannot touch the exterior.
This building is a prime example of the Art Deco movement that dominated Manhattan's skyline in the 1920s and 30s, and that's why it was given landmark status.
It has a limestone facade that Ralph Walker actually called as a drapery or a curtain wall, and the undulating facade is absolutely gorgeous in sunlight. Even if there was an opportunity, if it weren't landmarked, we certainly would not have taken it down. So that was one reason. But the second was it would be very complicated. We have the subway below us, that if we were to demolish something and, structurally, I think it would be even more complicated to build a new tower.
While knocking the building down would of course have been complicated, there was nothing simple about retrofitting this enormous block of offices. 30 elevators had to be demolished, then new ones rebuilt in the centre of the floor plan. Mechanical rooms, which had faced the New York Stock Exchange, also had to be moved.
The office demand for elevators is much different than residential because you've got those rush hour points of the day. We have 10 elevators for the residential apartments, down from the 30, and we put them all centralized into a core. Same thing with the staircases, so that it was made it much better for efficient layouts, and as well as ability to have light and air as well.
The decision was also taken to add 6 additional floors to house more apartments and take advantage of the spectacular views from the top of this structure. Those levels were added to the annex, a 30-storey section of the building that was constructed in the 1960s. Now, one of the benefits of adding floors to this part of the structure rather than at the very tip of the skyscraper is that the annex is incredibly sturdy.
So the original design was an office building with a heavier than required design load. So it was designed for a much heavier use than office originally. The weight requirement for residential is significantly lower than it is for office. So on the existing building that was 30 stories, we took advantage at each floor of that reduction. It adds up significantly where you can take advantage of it. We still had to strengthen the upper floors to receive the added weight.
Even with the sturdiness of the building below, they still needed to reduce the weight of the additional floors. To do this, they used voided slabs. These slabs were filled with plastic cylinders before a finishing layer of concrete was put on top.
And we made the added weight at the top less by using these plastic bubbles inside the slabs. So we did what looks on a finished product like a typical standard flat concrete floor plate, but in fact has inside it plastic bubbles inserted at strategic locations to reduce the weight further.
They did leave some areas as solid concrete, especially where structural columns came through the floors. But most of the slab was built using this technique. The process reduced the overall weight of the floors by about a third. It was also far easier to construct than if they'd used steel beams.
You would have had to install a tower crane, which is extremely expensive, or you'd have to dismantle the steel into smaller pieces, bring it up by elevator, reassemble it. The concrete itself can be pumped. The rebar can be brought to the elevator very easily, and the plastic bubbles are very lightweight. So everything was brought up through the construction hoists and then installed at the top.
An incredible amount of effort has gone into retaining the Art Deco aesthetic throughout the rest of the building. The Red Room is a glittering reception area that features floor-to-ceiling mosaics designed by a famous Art Deco artist. It's been closed off for nearly 2 decades, but now it's been lovingly restored.
The developer spent over $1 million restoring the mosaics. It's 33 feet tall. And the mosaics were cleaned with non-abrasive solutions. You can imagine that from 1931 to 2019, that's not nearly 100 years worth of whether it was cigarette smoke or what it would be on these mosaics, but it was carefully restored.
One Wall Street has now completed and welcomed the first of its new residents. But is it a symbol for the future of New York? As cities change, our buildings have to change and adapt with them. Perhaps nothing is more emblematic of the current state of the city than one of New York's ancient financial skyscrapers turning into apartments. We might be seeing many more of these iconic buildings changing or gaining floors in the future.
Many long, emotional, and at times excruciating years, One World Trade Center right behind me is finally open for business.
For years, deciding how to rebuild the World Trade Center sites has been a point of contention.
The design and construction has been fraught with controversy.
Use the original blueprints and design the new Trade Center exactly as it had been.
I'd rather have nothing than what they're building.
We're going to rebuild, and we did. We were not going to stop.
And if you've watched our channel before, you'll know that construction isn't exactly finished. In fact, there's a few buildings missing. 2 World Trade Center was set for completion years ago, but it's still searching for a tenant and still hasn't settled on a final design. But 5 World Trade Center is a different story. Unlike the other commercial skyscrapers on this site, this is the only one intended to be part residential.
A new skyscraper will soon be built at 5 World Trade Center. The 900-foot tall tower will have 1,200 housing units.
That means it comes with an entirely new set of terms and public debate compared to that of an office space. At the same time, New York City is in the middle of a housing crisis with skyrocketing rents, and new housing is desperately needed.
We need more housing, and we need it as fast as we can build it.
But this is no ordinary building site, and all eyes are set on what the latest World Trade Center tower will eventually become. Today, Lower Manhattan is the centre for government, international trade and finance, but that wasn't always the case. Before the Twin Towers opened in the 1970s, there was Radio Row, a commercial hub for hundreds of radio and television storefronts. But when plans for the original World Trade Center were finalised right on top of the neighbourhood in the 1960s, all these shops faced destruction. Concerned for their livelihoods, business owners, along with about 100 local residents, really pushed back, but ultimately it was to no avail. By the following decade, there sat a new complex of buildings on this site, one that went on to define the New York City skyline and become an integral symbol of the booming financial district. But these buildings didn't stand forever. They were later either destroyed or damaged by the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, altering the skyline and the very soul of this city forever. Despite the tragic events of that day, New Yorkers began to rebuild, but that process wasn't without controversy or lots of drawn-out decision-making. Fast forward to today, and you have One World Trade Center along with 3 other skyscrapers around a memorial. Yet portions of the site still remain empty. Let's take a look at 130 Liberty Street, where the previous Deutsche Bank building had stood. While it wasn't destroyed on 9/11, it was heavily contaminated, and after years of deterioration, the city finally demolished it. Now it remains an empty construction site waiting for the anticipated 5 World Trade Center. Just like the other structures in this district, the idea for its replacement has faced a myriad of revisions and public scrutiny. Daniel Libeskind, the architect behind the original master plan for the World Trade Center site, pictured 5 World Trade Center as a residential or mixed-use tower that looked something like this. And in 2007, New York City officials outlined a plan for a 42-story office tower with JP Morgan as the anchor tenant. But none of these ideas ever came to fruition, and the site continued to sit vacant. Then, in 2019, Governor Cuomo made a new request for designs that could be either residential or commercial. A couple of years later, Silverstein Properties and Brookfield Place unveiled a development for a 274-metre mixed-use building filled with apartments, office and retail space. Designed by Cohn Pedersen Fox, the skyscraper would have a floor-to-ceiling glass facade with steel-framed windows and rounded corners. It was a bit of a visual contrast alongside the neighbouring all-glass buildings on the site, like One World Trade Center. The building also had several terraces filled with greenery, including a wide space around the middle, which looks like it was intended for residential amenities. But the public debate hasn't revolved so much around the design of the building. Instead, it's focused on who will actually get to live in it. Back in 2021, 25% of the units were deemed to be affordable housing. But New York City's affordable housing policies are complex, to say the least, and it's certainly no secret that Manhattan rent is expensive. On average, a one-bedroom apartment in this city rings up to a staggering $5,588 a month. Prices that have made finding somewhere affordable to live an increasing struggle for many New Yorkers. Now, the city has a few main ways to address its housing issues. It maintains public housing developments, provides federal subsidies to some families, and caps the price of certain units in some buildings, like in 5 World Trade Center. To qualify for these so-called affordable units, residents must meet certain income requirements based on the household's percentage of the area median income. Then they must enter into a lottery system for the chance to rent one of the coveted apartments. But just because the program is called affordable housing doesn't mean it's necessarily affordable in the way that most of us might expect.
Those units are reserved for people making between 40 and 120% of the area median income. And those numbers are based on the median income for all of New York City. And I think some of New York suburbs are included in those calculations. For a family of 3, it's an income of between $50,000 on the low end and then $152,000 on the high end.
Under this system, one of those coveted apartments will roughly go for $1,300 to $3,800 a month. Ever since the percentage of affordable housing in 5 World Trade Center was announced, New Yorkers have had their fair share of opinions on what it should or shouldn't be. Although 25% of the 1,200 units were originally dedicated towards low-income residents, activists have been fighting to make it 100% affordable, with a portion reserved for 9/11 survivors and their families. While at first glance that might make a lot of sense, it would run up a hefty bill, a $500 million government subsidy to be exact, according to the site's developer. They said the money could go towards 3,600 units across the city instead of just 1,200 units inside 5 World Trade Center. But hold on a moment, what do we mean by government subsidy? Well, with the high price of land and construction in New York, building affordable housing just isn't very attractive to developers. The margins aren't there, and when luxury property is in demand, it's an easier business decision to build that instead. To make affordable housing work on sites like this, the government has to step in and subsidise its construction at taxpayers' expense. They effectively have to pay developers to build affordable housing. Right now, the economic conditions for affordable housing to be organically constructed don't really exist in Manhattan. It has to be engineered. Which begs the question, will the conditions ever exist again? And if not, what does that mean for the future of this city? Despite these dynamics, activists at 5 World Trade Center didn't back down from their demands for more affordable units. And after a couple of years of back and forth, New York Governor Kathy Hochul eventually reached a new deal in 2023. The number of affordable units would increase from 330 to 400, with 80 reserved for survivors of 9/11 and their families. Overall, this change will cost the state roughly $60 million in funding, with an additional $5 million coming from local authorities. As for the remaining 20% of the building space, 12% is going to go towards offices, and the rest is going to be made up of a mix of retail and public amenities for residents. Over 2 decades have passed since 9/11, and during that time, the World Trade Center site has seen several stops and starts towards its complete rebuilding. With this latest announcement finalised, construction for 5 World Trade Center is now expected to begin in 2024. It's the latest step in what the site has been envisioned to become ever since the decision was made to rebuild it all those years ago. Plans for 2 World Trade Center have been up in the air for years, but perhaps with 5 World Trade Center now seemingly progressing, the rest will soon follow. Most skyscrapers stand between 150 and 300 metres high. Those rising over 300 metres are called supertalls, and those going over 600 metres fall into the incredibly rare Megatall category. Only 4 buildings in the world have ever achieved this status, and none of them are in New York or even in the Western Hemisphere, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you consider that a city like New York sits on solid bedrock, has very little space and therefore needs to build upwards, and kind of knows a thing or two about skyscraper construction. So why isn't there a megatall skyscraper in New York City? The answer lies deep within its soul. New York's lack of megatall skyscrapers actually has nothing to do with engineering. It's entirely feasible to build over 600 metres high in the city thanks to solid bedrock and an incredible amount of expertise in the local area. If you wanted to build a megatall, then you could. But that's the problem. Hardly anyone wants to build a skyscraper that high in this city for a whole host of reasons. Firstly, there just isn't the demand. Manhattan's office market, which drove construction of the Empire State, World Trade Center and One Vanderbilt, had become saturated before the pandemic, and will likely take some time to recover afterwards. The luxury real estate market, which drove the construction of several super slender towers from small parcels of land along Billionaires Row in recent years, has also been cooling off. Those structures only really became financially viable because of the prices they were able to command for their location and park views. You couldn't let commercial office space for anywhere near the same rate. Past megatall skyscrapers have cost well over $1 billion to construct, so any developer would need to recoup a pretty considerable sum from office or residential lets to make a profit. But past megatall skyscrapers were not constructed in New York, a market that frequently tops the list of the world's most expensive cities to build in. Projects here cost several $100s more per square foot to build than in the Middle East or Asia. The availability of land in New York City also dramatically increases development costs. While engineers have pioneered a way to build slender skyscrapers that maximise floor area on very small sites, no slender tower has ever exceeded 472 metres, and megatalls require much larger bases. any developer would have to acquire the right size site in one of the world's most desirable cities. But even owning a suitable site doesn't give you license to build as high as you'd like, and all projects have to adhere to the city's strict zoning regulations to get planning permission. The rules use a floor area ratio equation to control the height of a structure relative to the size of its site and surrounding context. To build tall, developers have to acquire air rights from nearby properties in separate legal transactions and stack them onto their own sites. Those building megatalls would need to acquire enough rights to rise above 600 metres. Unfortunately, the barriers to constructing a megatall skyscraper in New York don't end there. Even if there was the demand and you were able to make the business case work, find the right size site and acquire all the air rights you need, one final and highly emotive hurdle would remain. One World Trade Center rises from ground zero in Lower Manhattan to a height of 1,776 feet, a nod to the year of American independence. Often dubbed the Freedom Tower, the skyscraper is the tallest in the city and holds huge symbolism for many New Yorkers. Though there's no official rule about building taller, doing so would be extremely difficult. Central Park Tower has a higher roofline than One World Trade Center, but was forced to abandon earlier plans for a large spire in the face of public outcry. Even if you persevered through the public scrutiny, there aren't many city mayors who would allow such an unpopular planning decision to go through on their watch. Looking beyond New York, megatall skyscrapers are always a serious undertaking wherever you build them, and each of the 4 constructed around the world so far has had more than its fair share of challenges, from engineering and economics to politics. In reality, there's yet to be a fully occupiable 600-metre plus building. The Burj Khalifa is accessible up to its 163rd floor, 585 metres above the ground. You can go 583 metres up in Shanghai Tower and 494 metres in Abraj Al Bait. Merdeka PNB 118, currently under construction in Malaysia, joins the Megatall club because of its near 144 metre high spire. Its highest occupiable floor is actually 500 metres above ground. Building above 600 metres is not a practical endeavour, but one undertaken for status. The 828-metre Burj Khalifa was not built out of a need to densify Dubai, but to bring the world's tallest building to the city and put the United Arab Emirates on the map. New York has no hunger for such status. It's already a world city attracting talent and investment from across the globe, with multiple iconic skyscrapers. Though not impossible, it seems unlikely that a megatall will ever emerge from these boroughs, and that the city most synonymous with the skyscraper may actually have topped out with one of its most revered structures. Head over to Manhattan's far west side and you'll spot a new skyscraper on the block. Twisting more than 300 metres into the sky, the Spiral is the latest supertall building taking shape on New York City's ever-evolving skyline. But this isn't just any old skyscraper. In a sea of glass, the Spiral will add a small touch of green through its cascading landscape terraces that will, yes, you guessed it, spiral around the building. The project's out to set a new standard for office design and finds itself completing at a time when the office tower's having a bit of an identity crisis. After sitting empty for nearly 2 years, there's now a battle underway to lure workers back to their offices.
One thing that can't happen, you can't stay home in your pajamas all day.
The Spiral pulls out all the stops: sustainable building practices, indoor-outdoor spaces, and a glimpse of nature 300 metres in the air. But will it mark the start of a new look for the New York skyscraper, or end up as an exception in the concrete jungle? When it completes later in 2022, the Spiral will be the 4th supertall building to come out of the Hudson Yards neighbourhood. That's a new area platformed over a live rail yard which, following a massive rezoning effort throughout the 2000s, has seen an explosion of construction projects in recent years. The new zoning codes have led to hotels, shops and new public space all opening up in the district. Then in 2016, the architects of Bjarke Ingels Group unveiled plans for a $3.7 billion skyscraper at 66 Hudson Yards, with Tishman Speyer as developers. Its design took inspiration from the spiral forms commonly found in the natural world and attempted to combine them with New York's classic skyscraper architecture. Now, wind back to the early 1900s, and there was very little regulation on building size and use in New York. As towers became taller and more densely packed, the streets of Lower Manhattan were getting darkened by their harsh shadows, and city planners began to get concerned. So in 1916, they passed a detailed zoning resolution. Unlike other cities, its code didn't impose any specific height limitations. Instead, high-rises had to remain within a diagonal plane from the base so that light and air could still reach the streets below. This regulation shaped buildings into stepped pyramids or wedding cake designs. You might recognise this feature as part of the Art Deco style, or for those of you less up to speed with your architectural eras, it's the building shape in all the Batman movies and comics. Throughout these decades, the famous New York skyline was revolutionised as distinctive skyscrapers sprung up right across Manhattan. Think Rockefeller Center and the Empire State. It wasn't until 1961 when the law was revised to account for more modern infrastructure like parking for cars and open office space. That law is still in effect for New York City buildings today. Now, despite the outdated 1916 code, the spiral still tries to embrace the classic New York form, while recognising that more than 100 years have now gone by. There are more modern materials, floor-to-ceiling glass panels that enclose over the stepped-back architecture, and what the developers are calling sustainable construction practices. As the spiral was going up, it used two main hoisting towers so that workers and materials could be transported quickly and efficiently up and down the tower. Unlike traditional construction methods, workers were enclosed in a platform made up of mesh panels. The material minimised wind and meant they could work faster and more safely. How'd you fancy spending your day inside one of these? Now, let's get on to the building's namesake. In a city known as the Concrete Jungle, the spiral introduces a splash of greenery, and no, it's not another rooftop garden. Around the building's exterior is a descending twist of landscape terraces filled with vegetation. The building's spiral connects all the way down to the High Line, New York's incredibly popular 2-kilometre-long elevated linear park. The idea is for these terraces to give people outdoor access from every floor, creating the chance for some fresh air and a break from sitting at a desk all day, something not all office buildings do. Just imagine being able to take meetings or sip your morning coffee here on a sunny day. Even if you love working in your pyjamas at home, most New Yorkers probably won't have a garden like this. In early 2022, plants were just beginning to appear on the spiral's facade, and more are set to be added in the warmer months of the year, including shrubbery, vines and trees.
Because the spiral is a full block building, we have different weather conditions on every single elevation. So we have most sun on south and west, whereas our northern side sees very little sun. The west side, because it's facing the river, is extremely windy. And because of the shape of the tower too, we are experiencing pretty extreme wind speeds in the winter months at tower corners.
Once greenery fills each terrace, the spiral will introduce an automated irrigation system so that every plant is properly watered.
So we use every terrace as a capture surface to retain rainwater, basically pump it back into tanks throughout the building, and then reintroduce it into our irrigation system for the terraces after that. Actively using all our horizontal surfaces to sustainably manage rainwater.
The spiral's exterior certainly brings something fresh to the city's architecture, but head inside, and that fresh vibe continues. In most skyscrapers, floors typically operate in isolation from each other like this. But in the spiral, the outside terraces become double atriums. They're all interconnected between each other in hopes to spur interaction between workers and offer an alternative to elevators. This might be a little more pleasant than your 6th floor walk-up. Green in both design and colour, these features all contribute to the building's effort to achieve LEED Gold standard. That's the global framework for structures to be environmentally friendly. The architects at BIG also hope that the integration between nature and the office will set the standard for future workplaces.
In addition, to seeing plants in vertical elevations, we are too very excited about seeing people at vertical elevation. I would too encourage my colleagues, to consider, right, that it's not only about giving the view, but it's actually, in a sense, giving back to the city, right? That by occupying its vertical space.
That's not to say the spiral didn't come without its challenges.
What is difficult about the spiral is the spiral itself, because you have to imagine that at every single floor we cantilever the building in by 2.5 feet. So there's a constant step, right, which puts a lot of pressure on the stiffness of the building core. We did have to provide horizontal trusses at every floor to contain building sort of willingness to pull itself apart.
Right now, around 70% of the building is leased. The largest tenant signed on is Pfizer, the firm behind many of our COVID-19 vaccines, but other notable companies include Turner Construction and AllianceBernstein. Of course, it remains to be seen just how green this tower's spiralling garden is going to become, and whether its design features are going to be enough to lure people back to the office. But judging from its appearance as it nears completion, it's likely to make a colourful mark on New York's skyline of concrete, steel and glass. Vertical urban greenery has been on the rise in recent decades, but mostly outside the US. Bosco Verticale in Milan and One Central Park in Sydney are just a couple of examples.
If we prove to be successful, right, growing that vertical garden on a skyscraper and then spark the willingness of the workforce to actually come to an office environment, we hope that maybe that will encourage others to undertake similar challenges.
The spiral hopes to drive the idea of sustainable design for New York's future skyscrapers, especially its office buildings. Yes, it's one of the first of its kind in this city, but perhaps the concrete jungle might get a whole new look in years to come.
The streets of New York.
It's been nearly a century since New York's skyscraper boom saw it transform into an iconic world-class city, and still, after all this time, things in the Big Apple are looking peachy.
Old New York, new New York, honey, at least it's New York.
Wall Street remains the unrivaled centre of global finance. There's an insatiable demand for office space. Housing is high quality and affordable. The subway is a world leader in reliability, and the city air smells of roses and freshly cut grass.
But that's a lie.
Back in the real world, New York is starting to lose its edge as the world's financial centre. Changes in post-COVID working patterns, competition from other hubs, and crippling apartment rents are creating a nightmare for the city of dreams. So NYC is fighting back the only way it knows how. By building big. This Supertall giant is what you get when New York tries to build our planet's best skyscraper. But will it be enough to help the capital of the world keep its crown? Here at the B1M, there's only one thing we love more than construction, a classic underdog story. So here goes. New York. It's North America's biggest city by population, a cultural powerhouse, and it's been the centre of the global financial system for most of the last century.
I'm walking here!
To help keep things that way is 270 Park Avenue, the new $3 billion headquarters of banking giant JP Morgan Chase. Designed by superstar architects Foster & Partners, at 423 metres high, it takes up an entire block on one of the most exclusive streets in Manhattan. See, doesn't it make your heart melt? Okay, again, maybe not, but a building like this takes some serious engineering, and that's something we can all enjoy. So you've got a design for a cutting-edge new skyscraper that's going to be the envy of the world, but this being New York, to build anything, you first have to knock something else down. Back in 2019, Manhattan said goodbye to the previous incumbent of 270 Park Avenue. the Union Carbide building. That was no simple job. At 216 metres, it was the tallest building to ever be voluntarily demolished. 3 floors were stripped out and reinforced, allowing the building to be split into 4 sections. Over the course of 2 years, each section was wrapped in a protective mesh and dismantled piece by piece. Now, although it was loved by architecture critics, the Union Carbide building was kind of emblematic of New York's decline. Post-pandemic, cities around the world have struggled. In February, commercial occupancy in the city was still roughly half of what it was before COVID. But while the mid-range buildings lay empty, there's still high demand for super premium modern office space, and that's where New York is starting to lose out. It just doesn't have very much of it. Back in the late 2010s, urban planners were worried about New York's aging stock of skyscrapers. That led to the rezoning of Midtown East in 2017, basically a rewriting of the planning laws, in an attempt to incentivize the construction of new world-class skyscrapers. But to make matters worse, the recent tall building boom down in Miami is threatening to knock New York off its top spot. Flashy new financial districts may be par for the course for any aspiring world city from Egypt to Malaysia, but Miami is a bit different. It's in the same time zone as New York, has broadly the same US regulations, but better weather. It's even earned the title the Wall Street of the South. Some speculate it could one day overtake NYC as the US's top financial center, provided it doesn't disappear underwater first. Now, I know, this may not be the cozy underdog story we all needed, but it does explain why there's a lot of expectation on buildings like 270 Park Avenue to keep New York competitive. Once demolition completed in 2021, construction could begin on the new tower. But it wasn't just what was sitting above ground that caused problems for engineers. Running directly under the construction site are train tracks leading into Grand Central Station, and below that, the MTA's $11 billion East Side Access megaprojects extending the Long Island Railroad deep into Manhattan. The new tower would be almost twice the height of the old one, meaning more extensive foundations. For a building this size, the standard approach would be to drill deep down into high-quality bedrock, or create shallower but wider deep pile foundations. But with 2 subway lines stacked just beneath the ground floor, this wasn't an option. Now, for the tower to get planning permission in the first place, it had to agree to create a new public plaza at street level, and Foster & Partners saw this as a way to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Because of the subway, engineers were forced to use many of the same footings as the original building's foundations, which consisted of shear walls running alongside the subway. To take the enormous weight of the building, these shear walls were reinforced with pile foundations underneath. The ground floor of the building was raised up onto a tabletop structure, which created the public area at ground level. This was propped up by a series of dramatic V-shaped columns directing the immense weight of the skyscraper down onto those carefully placed foundations underneath. With the extremely complex below-ground work complete, work on those V-shaped columns began. They'll run up the whole side of the building, creating the tower's visually striking look. Now, as we said, this is New York's comeback skyscraper, so naturally its design is something of a greatest hits. But not like that. The tower's setbacks and vertical lines echo the Art Deco forms of New York's early 1920s skyscrapers. But while the tower's design may reference Manhattan's heritage, its height and size is a clear nod to the ruthless nature of New York real estate. 270 Park will easily eclipse the towers it pays homage to. To reach its extraordinary height, JP Morgan Chase bought an astonishing 700,000 square feet of air rights from the nearby Grand Central Station and stacked them onto its site. With airspace agreed, the tower's steel frame began to rapidly rise. At each level, steel floor sheets are being laid across the beams before concrete is poured on top of them, forming the floor slabs. The tower's elevator and service cores are then rising up through the frame, and that whole process is going to continue right up to the very top of the tower, with the building's external cladding and then internal fit-out following close behind. But hold on a minute, the core rising through the frame is unusual. Most skyscrapers will build their concrete cores first, using a jump form system, with the wider steel or concrete frame superstructure following behind. Though it doesn't happen on every tower, New York is the one place where this is sometimes done differently. It all goes back to the steelworkers' unions preferring their own space without other trades in the way. When the tower completes, it'll rank as New York's 6th tallest skyscraper, but the tallest powered purely by electricity, supplied by a hydroelectric power station in upstate New York. And that's just one of many signs that this tower is pushing the evolution of the skyscraper. Special filtering systems increase natural airflow from outside, reducing the use of air conditioning. The architects also claim that the building reduces the use of electricity by circadian lighting design. That's the sun to you and me. But it's not just technology that makes this building different. Remember all those workers who are reluctant to return to the office? Well, the tower's owner is all too aware of the creature comforts people have got used to at home. To pamper the financiers who'll work in the building, wellness is central to its design. Even New Age guru Deepak Chopra is credited as a consultant on the project.
That's it. G, you are you. The only guru is your own self.
The building's set to include gyms, multi-faith prayer rooms, medical services, and more. So there you have it, an ultra-modern skyscraper to help put a city back on the map. Although, before we get ahead of ourselves, it's important to remember that this is owned by the world's richest bank. New York is one of the most complicated and expensive cities on Earth to build in, and creating towers like this is financially impossible for the majority of businesses, most developers, and even some billionaires. Will the rise of super premium office space help New York get its mojo back, or will this be just another deserted tower in a city in decline? Well, that all remains to be seen. What's certain is that New York has never been a place for the faint-hearted, and there are few things more iconic here than a sky-high mega-build. There's also the chance to dive deeper on 270 Park Avenue and the other topics on our channel over on the World's Best Construction Podcast, available right now wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, if you enjoyed this video and you want to get more from the definitive video channel for construction, make sure you're subscribed to the B1M.